Desert oceans. How China is farming seafood 3,000 miles from the sea. In the summer of 2023, a decision made thousands of miles away in Japan sent shockwaves through the global seafood industry. The Japanese government announced its controversial plan to release treated radioactive water from the damaged Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant directly into the Pacific Ocean. Since that August, the facility has completed 4 separate discharge operations, each one releasing thousands of tons of processed nuclear wastewater into the world's largest ocean. The reaction was immediate and honestly, pretty fierce. Across Asia, Europe, and beyond, consumers began questioning the safety of their sushi, their grilled fish, their favorite seafood dishes. Marine biologists raised alarms about potential ecosystem disruption. Fishing communities watched their livelihoods teeter on the edge of uncertainty. And in China, a nation that consumes more seafood than any other country on Earth, the government faced a troubling question. How do you feed 1.4 billion people when trust in ocean-caught seafood is rapidly eroding? The answer, as it turns out, came from one of the most unlikely places imaginable. Picture this: endless waves of golden sand stretching to the horizon, temperatures that can melt asphalt, winds so fierce they lift dust nearly 4 kilometers into the sky. This is the Taklamakan Desert, a sea of sand in northwestern China so vast and unforgiving that its name, in the local Uyghur language, translates roughly to the place of no return. For centuries, this 330,000 square kilometer wasteland has been synonymous with death, desolation, and the limits of human ambition. But today, something extraordinary is happening here. Something that, well, defies logic, challenges our understanding of agriculture, and might just represent the future of food production in an age of climate uncertainty. Chinese farmers are harvesting crabs, shrimp, and fish from the heart of one of the world's harshest deserts. Not dozens of pounds. Not as a novelty experiment, but tons of seafood every single day, from a farming operation that now spans 7,000 acres and generates more than $8 million in annual revenue. If this sounds impossible, I understand your skepticism. I had the same reaction when I first encountered this story. But what's happening in the Taklamakan Desert isn't science fiction, it's science fact. And the implications reach far beyond China's borders, touching on everything from food security to environmental restoration to the very future of how humanity will survive on an increasingly unpredictable planet. So how exactly do you farm seafood in a desert? What technology makes this possible? And what does this tell us about the innovative solutions emerging in our fight against climate change and environmental degradation? Let's dive in. To understand the magnitude of what's been accomplished here, you first need to understand just how hostile the Taklamakan Desert really is. Stretching across the heart of the Tarim Basin in China's Xinjiang region, the Taklamakan ranks as China's largest desert and the 10th largest desert system on our planet. More significantly, it holds the dubious distinction of being the world's second largest shifting sand desert, meaning its dunes are constantly on the move, driven by relentless winds that reshape the landscape on a daily basis. The numbers tell a story of extremes. The desert measures roughly 1,000 kilometers from east to west and 400 kilometers from north to south. Beneath your feet, if you were standing there, would be loose alluvial sand deposits that can reach depths of 300 meters. That's taller than the Chrysler Building, buried beneath your boots. The climate is equally merciless. Summer temperatures have been recorded at a staggering 67.2 degrees Celsius. That's over 150 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause second-degree burns on exposed skin within seconds. And if you think the nights offer relief, think again. Temperature swings of more than 40 degrees Celsius between day and night are routine, creating a thermal shock that makes survival incredibly challenging for any form of life. The wind is perhaps the desert's most defining characteristic. The Taklamakan sits at the crossroads of multiple prevailing wind patterns that sweep across northwestern China. These competing air currents create almost constant wind and sand activity. More than 80% of the desert consists of mobile dunes, meaning the landscape is literally never the same twice. When thermal updrafts develop as the sand heats during the day, particularly strong northeast winds can trigger violent sandstorms. During these events, dust and particulate matter can be lifted nearly 4,000 meters above sea level. The atmosphere becomes so saturated with airborne sand that visibility drops to near zero, and the entire desert transforms into a churning brown fog of suspended earth. For most of recorded history, this environment was considered utterly worthless for any form of productive human activity. The ancient Silk Road traders who skirted its edges told tales of entire caravans swallowed by shifting sands, of travelers who strayed from the paths and were never seen again. Modern mapmakers labeled it as wasteland, unsuitable for agriculture, inhospitable to settlement, valuable only as a geographic barrier. But China saw something different. The long game. 2 decades of desert dreams. China's relationship with its deserts has always been complicated. On one hand, desertification has been an ongoing environmental crisis, with productive land on the edges of places like the Taklamakan slowly surrendering to encroaching sand. On the other hand, these vast empty spaces have represented a challenge to the national character, a frontier to be conquered, a problem to be solved through human ingenuity and determination. Beginning in 2002, the Chinese government initiated what would become one of the most ambitious environmental restoration projects in human history. The initial strategy was deceptively simple. If the desert's primary problem was the absence of water, then the solution must be to bring water to the desert. This wasn't just about digging a few wells. Engineers developed a comprehensive ecological water transfer program designed to channel water from surrounding rivers and underground aquifers into the heart of the Taklamakan. Year after year, millions of cubic meters of water were pumped into the desert's interior, creating artificial lakes where none had existed for thousands of years. The hope was straightforward. Water the desert, and plants would follow. Plants would stabilize the soil. Stabilized soil would support more vegetation. More vegetation would moderate the climate, retain moisture, and gradually transform sections of the desert into productive green space. Except it didn't work, not in the way they expected. Yes, small lakes formed. Yes, some hardy vegetation began to appear around their edges. But the transformation was limited, localized, and frustratingly slow. Most of the desert remained as barren as ever, seemingly immune to these human interventions. Scientists studying the failed greening efforts soon realized they had fundamentally misunderstood the challenge. Adding water alone wasn't enough because the desert wasn't just dry, it was an entire ecosystem, or rather, the absence of one. What they needed wasn't just moisture, but a complete biological system with multiple interconnected components. Water, yes, but also soil organisms, plant life, animal activity, and the countless micro-interactions that make a living environment truly sustainable. But there was another complication, one that would accidentally point the way toward a solution nobody had anticipated. When fresh water turns to salt. As water pooled in the newly created desert lakes, something unexpected happened. The water didn't stay fresh. The Taklamakan sand, it turned out, was rich in mineral deposits and salt compounds accumulated over millions of years of geological processes. As water percolated through this sand, it dissolved these minerals, creating increasingly saline conditions. Within months, many of the artificial lakes had transformed from fresh water sources into brackish or even fully saline pools. For the original greening project, this was a disaster. Most desert-hardy plants that could theoretically take root in this environment require fresh water. The saltwater lakes couldn't support them. It seemed like the entire experiment was doomed to failure. But then someone asked a different question. If we accidentally created saltwater lakes in the middle of the desert, what if we stopped trying to turn them into freshwater oases? What if we worked with the salt instead of against it? This shift in thinking was revolutionary. Instead of seeing the saline water as a contamination problem, what if it was actually an opportunity? After all, 70% of Earth's surface is covered by saltwater oceans. A huge portion of human food consumption comes from marine environments. The world's fishing industry represents a multi-billion-dollar global economy based entirely on saltwater species. What if you could create an inland ocean? The concept was audacious, perhaps even crazy. But Chinese researchers at the forefront of ecological restoration began testing the hypothesis. They analyzed the mineral composition of the Taklamakan saline water and compared it to natural seawater. The profiles weren't identical, but they were surprisingly similar. With careful adjustments, adding specific trace elements here, introducing beneficial probiotic bacteria there, they could potentially create an artificial marine environment capable of supporting actual ocean-dwelling creatures. In 2017, after years of laboratory testing and small-scale trials, researchers made a critical decision. They would attempt to introduce a living marine species into the desert's saltwater lakes. But which species? The choice was crucial. Whatever they selected would need to be incredibly hardy, capable of surviving in conditions that, while similar to the ocean, were far from identical. It would need to tolerate significant temperature fluctuations, adapt to water chemistry that might vary more than in natural marine environments, and ideally offer both ecological and economic value. After evaluating dozens of candidates, scientists settled on a remarkable creature, the blue crab. The crab that conquers deserts. The blue crab is an evolutionary marvel, and it's not hard to see why researchers chose it as their pioneer species for desert aquaculture. Found naturally in coastal waters across several continents, blue crabs have developed an almost supernatural ability to survive in varying and challenging conditions. But their most impressive trait is their response to drought conditions. When water becomes scarce or environmental conditions turn hostile, blue crabs can enter a state of deep dormancy, essentially shutting down most of their metabolic processes to conserve energy and moisture. In this dormant state, a blue crab's need for water drops dramatically. Its feeding stops. Its reproductive cycle pauses. Its movement becomes minimal. To an outside observer, the creature might appear dead. But internally, critical life functions continue at an extremely reduced rate, allowing the crab to survive periods that would kill most other marine species. Then, when conditions improve and water returns, blue crabs can rapidly reactivate. Within hours or days, they return to normal activity levels, resume feeding, and continue their life cycles as if nothing had happened. This biological flexibility makes them uniquely suited to environments where water availability might fluctuate or where conditions aren't consistently optimal. But the blue crab's value extends beyond mere survival. The meat is delicious with a sweet, delicate flavor prized in markets around the world. Blue crabs are rich in protein, low in fat, and contain beneficial omega-3 fatty acids. In traditional Chinese medicine, they're also believed to have health-promoting properties, adding cultural value to their economic worth. The first trial populations were introduced into controlled sections of the Taklamakan's artificial saltwater lakes with cautious optimism. Would they survive? Would they thrive? Could they reproduce? The answer to all three questions was yes. The blue crabs not only survived, they flourished. The desert-raised crabs grew to healthy sizes, their meat quality matched or even exceeded ocean-caught specimens, and most importantly, they began reproducing, creating self-sustaining populations that didn't require constant restocking. This success opened the floodgates both literally and figuratively. From experiment to industry. Recognizing the enormous potential of what had been discovered, the Chinese government shifted its approach from cautious experiment to active encouragement. If seafood could be successfully farmed in the desert, the economic possibilities were, honestly, staggering. Here was a chance to transform what was once considered worthless land into productive agricultural space, create new industries in underdeveloped regions, and perhaps most importantly, develop food production systems that were completely insulated from ocean pollution concerns. By the year 2020, the small experimental ponds had expanded into a vast aquaculture operation, covering 7,000 acres of former wasteland. The government established specialized industrial parks dedicated to saline alkali land aquaculture, complete with research facilities, processing centers, and business incubators designed to help entrepreneurs enter this new industry. Local residents, many of whom had lived for generations in poverty on the edges of the useless desert, suddenly found themselves with new economic opportunities. Farmers could apply for sections of land and establish their own aquaculture operations. With technical support from government scientists and access to seedling stocks, individuals who had never even seen the ocean in their lives became seafood farmers. The species list expanded beyond blue crabs. Researchers successfully introduced multiple varieties of shrimp, which adapted well to the controlled saline environments. Various fish species, selected for their tolerance to variable water chemistry, took hold in the larger lakes. Clams and other bivalves found suitable conditions in the mineral-rich water. Each successful species introduction added diversity to the ecosystem and created new market opportunities. The ecological benefits extended beyond just the water. As aquaculture operations expanded, they created jobs, which brought more people to previously empty areas. More human activity meant more infrastructure, roads, power lines, communication networks. Water systems developed for the aquaculture operations also supported limited agricultural activities around the lake edges. Vegetation that had sprouted tentatively in the early years now had stable water sources and began to spread more aggressively. Plants that had lain dormant in the sand for years, their seeds waiting for conditions that hadn't existed in centuries, suddenly began to germinate. The introduction of water and the biological activity from aquaculture operations enriched the soil with nutrients from fish waste and decaying organic matter. This created conditions where desert plant species could establish themselves more effectively than in the earlier failed greening attempts. A complete ecosystem was forming, not by fighting the desert, but by working with its unique characteristics. From desert to dinner plate. By 2022, the Taklamakan's seafood production had reached commercial viability. The first major shipments of desert-raised crabs, shrimp, and fish reached urban markets in China's eastern cities, nearly 3,000 kilometers away. Consumer response was overwhelmingly positive, but not for the reasons you might expect. Yes, the novelty factor helped. Who wouldn't be intrigued by seafood from the desert? But the real selling point was safety. In a world where ocean pollution had become a major concern, particularly after the Fukushima water releases, consumers were actively seeking seafood sources they could trust. The Taklamakan operations offered something no ocean fishery could match: complete environmental control and total isolation from marine contamination. Every aspect of the water chemistry was monitored. The artificial seawater was created from tested, clean water sources with carefully measured mineral additions. There was no risk of mercury accumulation, no microplastic contamination, no exposure to agricultural runoff or industrial pollutants, and certainly no possibility of radioactive isotope contamination from nuclear wastewater. Taste tests confirmed what early samples had suggested. The desert seafood was, honestly, exceptional. Crabs grown in the controlled environment developed sweet, clean-tasting meat. Shrimp were firm-textured and flavorful. Fish raised in the clear, monitored water lacked the muddy taste that sometimes affects pond-raised fish in traditional aquaculture settings. Premium restaurants began featuring Taklamakan seafood on their menus, often at prices that actually exceeded those for ocean-caught alternatives. The story behind the food, the technological innovation, the environmental restoration, the triumph over seemingly impossible odds, added value that consumers were willing to pay for. production numbers climbed steadily. On average days, the various aquaculture operations across the desert region were harvesting between 400 and 500 kilograms of seafood daily. During peak seasons in spring and fall, when the weather conditions were optimal and multiple species reached harvest size simultaneously, daily catches could exceed 1,200 kilograms. At current market prices, the annual revenue from the Taklamakan aquaculture industry has surpassed $8 million and continues to grow. For context, that's approximately the same annual revenue as a mid-sized commercial fishing vessel operation on the coast, except this is happening in an environment where, just 20 years ago, nothing lived and nothing grew. Scaling up. The next wave. Success breeds ambition, and by 2024, the Taklamakan project was ready to dramatically scale up operations. In April of that year, one of the largest seedling release events in aquaculture history took place along the edges of the desert. 80 million flower clam seedlings were introduced into prepared sites. 3 million razor clam seedlings followed. 30,000 additional blue crab juveniles were released into expanding territories. These weren't just additions to existing operations, they were the foundation for entirely new farming areas. Geological surveys had identified more than 100,000 acres of desert land with conditions suitable for saline alkali water aquaculture. That's an area larger than the entire city of Denver, Colorado. If even half of that land could be converted to productive aquaculture, it would create one of the largest seafood production facilities on Earth, situated thousands of kilometers from the nearest ocean. But researchers weren't content to simply scale up existing operations. They were pushing the boundaries of what species could survive and thrive in the desert environment. In early May 2024, after successful trials with crayfish, salmon, and Australian freshwater lobsters, scientists introduced 1 million juvenile Macrobrachium rosenbergi, a species of giant river prawn, into experimental sections of the aquaculture zones. These seedlings came from China's Freshwater Fisheries Research Institute, one of the country's premier aquaculture research centers, which had been collaborating with the Desert Project to identify new species with commercial potential. Each new species represents years of careful research. Scientists must determine optimal water conditions, suitable feed sources, potential disease vulnerabilities, and viable reproduction protocols. They study the ecological interactions between species, ensuring that introducing a new organism won't disrupt the delicate balance that's been established in the artificial marine environment. The water management systems have become increasingly sophisticated. Modern aquaculture operations in the Taklamakan use closed-loop or semi-closed-loop systems that recycle and conserve water resources. In an environment where water is precious, minimizing waste isn't just environmentally responsible, it's economically essential. These systems filter and clean water, removing waste products while retaining beneficial minerals and nutrients. They monitor oxygen levels, temperature, pH, and dozens of other parameters in real time, making automatic adjustments to maintain optimal conditions. They've achieved water use efficiency levels that would be impossible in traditional ocean fishing, or even in most coastal aquaculture operations. The environmental impact has been profound. Far from degrading the desert environment, the aquaculture operations have catalyzed broader ecological restoration. The stable water bodies have allowed wetland plant species to establish themselves around the lake edges. These plants provide habitat for migrating birds, which bring seeds from other regions, further accelerating the diversification of plant life. Insects have appeared, first simple species like flies and beetles, then more complex pollinators attracted by the flowering plants around the water margins. Small mammals have been observed in areas where no animal life existed a decade ago, drawn by the water sources and emerging vegetation. The desert isn't becoming an oasis in the traditional sense, it's becoming something perhaps more interesting. A unique hybrid ecosystem that combines elements of desert, wetland, and agricultural landscapes into something entirely new. The historical context. This isn't the first time. While the Taklamakan project has received enormous attention, it's worth noting that desert seafood farming isn't entirely unprecedented in China. As far back as 1990, a visionary entrepreneur began exploring the possibilities of raising fish in desert environments. His motivation wasn't environmental restoration or food security concerns. It was simple economics. He saw empty land, access to underground water sources, and recognized an opportunity. After years of research and preparation, in 2001 he established a 1,200-acre fish farming operation in the Kumtag Desert, another harsh environment in western China. He constructed 15 large ponds and stocked them with 600,000 rainbow trout fry. The Kumtag Desert presented different challenges than the Taklamakan. In some ways, conditions were even more extreme. But the entrepreneur had identified one crucial advantage: abundant spring water emerging from underground aquifers. This natural water source, while limited, was sufficient to support cold water fish species if managed carefully. Rainbow trout, native to cold rivers and streams, typically require consistent water temperatures below 20 degrees Celsius. Maintaining these conditions in a desert where summer temperatures regularly exceed 40 degrees Celsius required innovative solutions. Deep ponds helped maintain cooler temperatures in the lower water layers. Strategic planting of trees provided shade. Underground pipes brought spring water at consistent cool temperatures to refresh the ponds. Against considerable odds, the operation succeeded.